Hey everyone, wherever you are, I hope you're having a wonderful week so far. We're here with the latest episode of the Inside Crypto Show, interviews and discussions with regular people just like yourselves. Today we're joined by Alan Chiu, who's the co-founder and CEO of Enya Labs, also a core contributor to Boba Network, with more than 20 years of experience in building and investing in enterprise and fintech startups. He leads the efforts at achieving Boba Network's goal of bringing Ethereum to the next billion users world. Before we get started, I have to do the usual disclaimer. Anything said on today's show by either Ellen or myself does not constitute financial advice. Our opinions are our own and are not to be connected with our respective organizations. Please do your own research. Ellen, thank you so much for making time today, especially it's almost after work for you. Tell us about yourself.
Thank you for having me here, Kriyan. Hello, everybody. Great to meet you. So I started my career as a software engineer working on distributed systems, and fortunately had a couple of pretty good exits in that space. And that was in Canada, and wanted to really work with the best in the industry to build and support tech companies. So that brought me to Stanford, moving to Silicon Valley, to the Bay Area. And after the Stanford Business School, I spent a few years as a venture capitalist, investing in seed stage enterprise, fintech, and AI companies. But several years ago, I really started getting restless, wanted to go back to building companies again, and co-founded Enya Labs. And last year, we launched Boba Network.
Wow, that is super fast. I want to ask you this question because I feel like in the tech space, we're like 50% of people are like, okay, crypto is cool, the technology is cool. And then there's the other 50% who still are not quite there. Like you being in Silicon Valley, what's the feelings around crypto and crypto tech?
Let's start with just the technology perspective. And that's really the one that got me really intrigued in the first place, given my distributed systems background, because up until the emergence of blockchains, especially Ethereum, introducing programmability to blockchains, all the previous generations of distributed systems relied on some sort of administrative entity to decide which computers can join that network and help with sharing the compute load, help store data. But blockchain changed that fundamentally by creating a permissionless network anyone could join, and it relies on economic incentives to read out different forms of consensus algorithms to make sure that the whole network will arrive at the right conclusion and weed out any nefarious actors. And that's really the core innovation that opened up a lot of possibilities that weren't possible before. Fundamentally, it's the permissionlessness nature of blockchains that paved the way for potentially much more inclusive economic infrastructure that can be built on this technology.
Okay. Alan, why do you think we still have a lot of people who are, we'll get into that a bit later, but what do you think we have so many people who are still very distrustful of the space, who are just like going back to Silicon Valley, smart engineering, tech focused people? They see the technology and they're like, okay, despite the technology, I still don't think this is a good idea. I don't believe it. It's a scam, Ponzi, blah, blah, blah. How do we overcome this distrust?
Yeah, it is a challenge, right? Because what's happening with each wave of new technology, especially the more transformative and disruptive the technology is, the more likely this is going to happen, because these emerging trends will simultaneously attract the brightest minds who truly have their hearts in building out the infrastructure, building out the technology for the good of the rest of society, as well as opportunists who just want to jump in, make a quick buck. They have really no desire to build anything for the long term. And for outsiders looking in, it's really hard to tell who's really building something of substance versus who's just trying to make a quick buck and scam people out of their hard-earned money.
Wow, I've actually never heard somebody mention that like in this way, and that's so true. Regular people, like maybe your mom or my mom, looking in and okay, who is this person and who is that person? Who do we follow? And yeah, that's such a good point.
And when you look at like the early days of .com, right? For the average mainstream consumer, in the early days, if you look at Amazon.com versus many others who didn't make it was hard for them to tell the difference.
Totally true. Well, I brought up the distrust issue, so we'll dive straight into today's like first two questions. And I know if anybody watching or listening, you've dealing with issues with FTX, I'm really sorry. Try to do your best, you'll get through it. Alan, being a fintech person, being in venture capital, what do you think's happened? We do know what's happened, but what happened with FTX? Why did we go from venerating this company, top 5 in terms of trading volume, as far as exchanges goes to now it's bankrupt. And
Well, speaking of being hard to tell the good from the bad, right? This is a prime example. It's not just the average consumer that finds it difficult. Even seasoned investors and industry insiders sometimes get it wrong, like in the case of SBF. He got a lot of people to trust him, and folks with existing strong social credibility who throw their names behind him, the more people trust SBF by extension, because social proof is one of the major contributors to building influence. What really happened here, I think, as more facts emerge, is highly likely that they misappropriated customer assets for other purposes. Whatever that is, as an exchange, the customer assets belong to the customers, not to the exchange. They should just never be touched to begin with. But they broke that trust and went to great lengths to hide that fact until it could no longer be hidden. And now more and more of those facts are coming out. I think we're just scratching the surface of figuring out what really went on. But unfortunately, this is one of the downsides of centralization, is the one of centralization of power, but also the lack of transparency into what's happening behind the scenes. Now, in the traditional financial world, we compensate for that by delegating powers to regulators to keep traditional financial institutions honest, whether it's the New York Stock Exchange or JP Morgan, big banks. But in this case, we got the worst of both worlds, where FTX was operating in an unregulated territory and without any transparency. Right? So there was really no oversight over how they were using these customer funds, customer assets. And because they weren't operating on a blockchain, unlike DeFi protocols, there was also no way for the public to monitor and provide oversight over how they were really running their business either.
that's very true. Alan, do you think, I've seen in the last week or so people like, okay, this is why we need decentralization, but at the same time, like looking to some of the regular people in crypto, I still don't imagine regular people saying, okay, I'm going to open up a MetaMask, I'm going to open up a Phantom wallet, I'm going to open up whatever wallet it is, and I'm going to start doing crypto that way. I think it's still, that stuff is still a fairly large hurdle. How do we get people from centralized exchanges into DeFi in an easy way? Boba, of course, is a solution, but like, how do we solve this problem? Because centralized exchanges are easy, the interfaces are familiar, but DeFi is really not easy.
Yeah, and that speaks to how big a gap that exists today between the level of convenience and smoothness in user experience that mainstream users expect versus what we're delivering as an industry today. There's a huge gap, and that's what's created an opportunity for centralized exchanges to exist, because when push comes to shove, most users will choose convenience over security, right? So as an industry, we got to work even faster to close that gap in user experience while still maintaining the benefits of doing things on the blockchain, providing transparency, auditability, immutability, so that trust is built into the system, so that we don't need to delegate trust to centralized figures.
I totally agree. Going back to trust and transparency, right? That is another big call this week. It's, yeah, we need regulation. And people are like, yeah, SBF was meeting with regulators and stuff to push for regulation. That's strange. How did this happen? The term proof of reserve was thrown around. Do you think the next step after this situation is regulation, more regulated crypto? Is that the next step?
I think more regulation is definitely coming. That's just a natural response that policymakers are going to have, especially in light of such an implosion of a key player in an industry at this scale. We look at the last great financial crisis, a lot of new regulations came out of that. I don't think this is going to be any different. Of course, the danger is overreaching and jumping to a new set of regulations without fully understanding the implications of these regulations, especially when it comes to, this is not just a couple of bad actors who took advantage of loopholes in an existing industry. We're talking about whole new technologies in creating a new industry. And it's admittedly difficult for policymakers to keep up, because they're not in the industry day to day, and most of them don't have an engineering background to really understand how the technology works. And unfortunately, when a blow up like this happens, especially with an institution that was led by a formerly trusted player in the industry, it casts a dark shadow over the rest of the industry, makes it harder for other industry players to speak up and rebuild the trust with the policymakers that has been damaged through this incident. So more regulations definitely are coming. It's unavoidable. I'm hoping that as the dust settles, the policymakers will be more open to input from the other industry actors who are acting in good faith, in that they will continue to engage with the industry to craft regulations that do offer consumer protection, but at the same time do not stop us from innovating. And especially when in the US, where this country has been at the forefront of so many ways of technology innovation until now, that we don't lose out on the potential and the good that Web3 can do, not just for this country, but also for the rest of the world.
Definitely. Going back to regulation again, like I've been following a few podcasts and media, and I feel like a lot of crypto people in general, okay, if we're going to be regulated, we want to be regulated by the CFTC, right? Whereas I believe the SEC is, no, we need to regulate crypto. Do you sit anywhere on that fence? Is who do you think should be regulating crypto? Should it be either of these organizations or someone else, or should there be another regulatory body that's created by the government? What do you think?
I think what matters more than which regulatory body has control over this set of regulations is actually the substance of the regulations that come down. Some folks prefer the CFTC over the SEC because they might not like the current administration over SEC, but that could change every 4 years, right? But we got to think long term about what is the substance of the regulation that is going to be affecting the entire industry. And if substantively the regulations actually are sensible, it's okay if the SEC is the enforcer. It doesn't really matter as long as the regulations are sensible and the regulatory body stays true to both the letter and the spirit of those rules and don't overreach. I think it doesn't really matter which regulatory body it ends up being.
Yep, that's true. And that makes a lot of sense as well. It's important for the right regulations. Okay, I know a lot of you listening to the podcast or watching the video on YouTube, I've been waiting for me to get over this current news stuff. We're over it. We're going to talk about Boba and Enya Labs. And I guess my first question is, I think everybody maybe in sort of my level of crypto, okay, we know who Boba is, because I know when I was approached about this podcast, I'm like, Enya Labs, that sounds cool. The name Enya is cool, especially if you're like a bit older like me, we used to listen to the music. So I'm guessing, and you can correct me, Alan, and then tell everybody on the podcast, Enya Labs is the organization that created Boba, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, we got Boba off the ground. We started. Boba itself is really a decentralized project where Enya is a core contributor to it, and welcome any developer to join us and to help build Boba. And Boba Network is governed by a DAO. Boba token is both a governance token and a fee token for the network.
Oh, very cool. Okay, let's talk about Enya Labs. So Enya Labs got Boba off the ground. What other things are you doing at Enya?
Over the years, we've built a number of things. For example, during COVID, so one of our core pieces of technology is actually cryptography, especially in the area of multi-party computation. So during COVID, we actually leveraged that technology to build a COVID symptom tracker where schools and offices, businesses would use SaaS service to ask anyone coming onto their premises to report what symptoms they might have. And the service would let them know how likely it is this person is infected with COVID. And if they're flagged as a potential infection, then the school, for example, would turn them away and ask them to go get tested. And we're able to build the service in such a way that did not require centrally storing any health symptoms at all. In fact, the software itself, the backend, applied a machine learning trained model to assess the likelihood that someone was already infected with COVID without looking at the actual health symptoms because of the multi-party computation, secure multi-party computation technology that we deployed.
Wow, I'm a big fan of machine learning, and you've got blockchain as well. Looking through the Boba side, looking through the Enya side, right? Like you mentioned machine learning. Does Boba incorporate machine learning at all, or is it going to incorporate machine learning at some point? Is crypto going to incorporate machine learning?
So the fact that we actually had built something in the machine learning space actually led us to create what is called hybrid compute, Boba Network, because you cannot do machine learning on chain today because it's too expensive, right? There's not enough compute capacity to perform machine learning on a blockchain, which actually kind of sucks because machine learning is such a big part of so many software products on the market today. And a lot of the personalized experiences that mainstream users have gotten accustomed to, they're driven by machine learning in the background. So if the Web3 world, the blockchain world, when developers are building these applications, they handcuff, they can't use things like machine learning, then the level of user experience for Web3 users is always going to lag behind mobile and Web2. And that becomes a big deterrent to widespread adoption of Web3. But they will always recognizing that there's always a computational overhead to be paid for consensus on chain, and consensus is a key attribute to how blockchains work. It doesn't make sense to shoehorn machine learning on chain, which led us to creating this idea of, hey, what if we allowed application developers to run these computationally intensive workloads like machine learning off chain, but give them the ability to incorporate the results from these models on chain. And that's what gave rise to this concept of hybrid compute, which we launched in Q1 this year. It allows smart contracts to invoke any off-chain API. They could be calling an existing Web2 service like Twitter or an off-chain gaming engine, right? Or their own API behind which they will run their own machine learning model. And that gives developers the best of both worlds, the permissionless nature of Web3 and the ability to tap into off-chain compute infrastructure that's much more scalable, that could support more computationally intensive workloads like machine learning.
So this is going to be my next question as well, because I was looking at L2 Beat, right? And I remember seeing Arbitrum #1 as far as L2's Optimism #2. Is this the key difference? Like, are you the only people doing this hybrid compute in the L2 space at the moment?
Not the only. And like, now that you understand where we're coming from and what we're trying to achieve here, this is why we don't really focus on TVL or total value locked as a metric that we're optimizing for, because that's a very DeFi centric metric, right? How much capital is locked on your network. Whereas what we're trying to enable is a Web3 infrastructure that interoperates with Web2 infrastructure, whether we're talking about using the existing Web2 infrastructure to run machine learning, or tapping into enterprise data stores to use these data sets to personalize the on-chain experience, or tapping into existing Web2 services. We're creating this integrated, interconnected fabric for developers to build on. Over time, they're probably not going to be all DeFi developers, right? For example, we're already starting to see Web2, Web3 hybrid games leveraging hybrid compute. And what matters is extending the benefits of Web3 to as many users as possible, not necessarily locking up as much asset as possible, right? We're not in the game of competing for capital on our network. We're trying to serve developers and users. If they want to put capital on our network for DeFi, great. But that's just one of the many use cases that are going to come.
Okay, you make some really good points. But at the moment, it's very unfortunate, because I remember when I was looking at L2 Beat, I'm like, okay, Boba is like #9. But and then now you're talking, I'm like, yeah, that's really a huge understatement, because you, like you said, you aren't competing for DeFi capital, but at the same time, everyone's judging you on this standard of, okay, you have X amount of money locked into your network. So how do you overcome that sort of stereotype of saying, hey, Boba is not just a DeFi destination, it's this infrastructure destination, and in doing so, saying, hey, this is actually valued at much more than in the TVL number?
So ultimately, the real sign of traction is, are people using your network or not? Ultimately, that's the metric that matters. If no one's using your network, it doesn't matter if you have $10 billion to TVL if the TVL is not doing anything. So what matters is most is actually transaction volume. Is your network being used? So that's the metric that we pay attention to. Now, we're also the first layer 2 to go multi-chain, which means our transaction volume data currently are spread across multiple chains. We have block explorers on all of them to report on the latest transaction volume. So the data is all publicly available, but it takes some work to aggregate them together. And then, of course, report it out to the wider public. It's not that the data is hidden, it's all out there. What we're building towards is actually getting the data across these different deployments of Boba on multiple chains, and then making them available to sites like L2 Beat, and hopefully they will start reporting on the transaction volume in addition to TVL, so that their users have a more holistic view of which networks actually are getting used.
Nice. You mentioned multi-chain, and for people who are watching the YouTube video, they can see the Boba logo, just like the cool one you have above your head over there, the universal L2 for all blockchains. And I think maybe I was just looking in the wrong place, but Alan, for our audience, could you tell us, like, what chains are you guys actually on, or are you on every chain?
So we started on Ethereum, and since then we have expanded to Moonbeam, Avalanche, BNB, and Phantom. So we're currently live on 5 layer ones.
Nice. Any possibilities for non-EVM chains in the future?
That's always possible. It does require more engineering work, but yes, we haven't lost sight of that part of the layer one ecosystem as well.
Okay, nice. Okay, going back to the idea of scalability, one of the things I find, I like to talk about the regular user because unfortunately, where I live in Taiwan, most of the people I know are regular crypto users. And I find that I don't know any regular people who are using L2s. And I think that's unfortunate. Do you know, how do we bring L2s to more people?
That's a great question. Today's user experience for onboarding a new user to L2 is cumbersome. We're working on to streamline that process to a certain degree. It doesn't solve the entire problem. It's partnering with fiat on-ramps so that users can directly convert fiat to, for example, Boba tokens directly on Boba Network and then start interacting with the network that way. We've also been working on integrations with crypto exchanges because yes, on one hand, there's always risk to having your assets on centralized exchanges. On the other hand, they do provide a much better user experience for new users who are new to crypto than jumping directly into an on-chain, purely on-chain experience. So we've been working with multiple centralized exchanges, have these integrations so that users can more easily move the assets. They can, for example, buy Boba tokens on a centralized exchange and move them over to our network and use them to start paying fees. Now, with our current focus on gaming, with more and more gaming projects coming online on different deployments of Boba, we expect these games to play a huge role in attracting new users to the network, where these users don't necessarily even need to interact directly with Boba Network, right? Because they're just playing with these games, but the games have taken care of a lot of the onboarding challenges for new users. Now, behind the scenes, our engineering team is also working on a key feature called account abstraction. For the non-technical audience, basically what that enables, one of the things it enables is for game developers to pay for gas fees for their players, which is huge, right? Because the games could decide to monetize in a different way and monetize enough to cover the gas for the users, and therefore they don't have to bother the users to sign up on transactions. They'll just do it for them and pay for the gas for them. And that would go a long way towards creating a much smoother user experience.
That's totally true. Like most people listening to this podcast, well, I love games. Like I play at least an hour of games a day. Not to mention Web3 gaming as well. I do most of my Web3 gaming on Polygon. The gas fee stuff kind of sucks. Like it ruins that immersion when you're playing a game and it says, hey, now you're out of this, please sync with the blockchain. Or I always see this button on this game that I play. It says sync with the blockchain, pay 0.1 Matic. And that definitely sucks. The idea of account abstraction is just awesome. To hide that irritating layer under something else, it's awesome, and it's still there, but the game developer is taking care of it, and that's awesome. You mentioned gaming a few times. Is there anything that like we could be excited about gaming wise on the Boba Network? Any game name or gaming idea that you can talk about if you can?
Evil Versus, for example, on Boba AVAX, which is the Boba network running on Avalanche, uses hybrid compute as part of their game. And so definitely encourage the listeners out there to check it out. Imperium, Empires is also coming to Boba. So follow Boba Network on Twitter. Every new game that launches on Boba, regardless of what the layer one is, will be announced on Twitter from our main account, Boba Network. The website is boba.network.
Yes.
But for the latest news, just come to Twitter, follow Boba Network.
Okay, come to Twitter, follow Boba Network. Very nice. Okay. Yes, I'm definitely going to do that because I love games. So Alan, like you mentioned, is there a reason you focused on gaming? Do you see that as the best place for onboarding people in the future?
At least for now, there will be new applications that will be developed that we can't even dream of today. That's the beauty of working on really transformative technology that forms a new infrastructure for developers. But as of now, gaming still has a lot, games generate a lot of transactions on the blockchain. And people continue to play games even in recessionary times. Some might argue that they will play spend even more time in games during recessions. Whereas in a high interest rate, high inflation environment, use cases like DeFi and NFT speculation is going to be really challenged. So for the near term, we're really focused on gaming. Now, going forward, we expect there will be many more new applications that take advantage of hybrid compute that allows developers to combine Web3 and Web2 together. And those are going to be brand new applications because these are applications that you cannot build on a traditional blockchain alone.
You mentioned hybrid compute, and one of the things on your website, I think it's either Enya Labs, I'm pretty sure it's Enya Labs, that you mentioned augmenting smart contracts, and hybrid compute, of course, augments an existing smart contract. So are there other technologies that you're working on to augment the idea of smart contracts?
Well, hybrid compute is the main foundation that we're building on, and we're evolving it as we speak, actually. So recently, for example, we introduced more complex data structures that we're going to support in hybrid compute beyond the original implementation. And as more and more developers build on hybrid compute, we're going to keep evolving this protocol to support the needs of developers.
Oh, nice. Okay, very cool. And what's the best place to read about hybrid compute? That would be Enya Labs, I assume.
Actually, you can come to Boba.network. The Boba website has a lot of resources on hybrid compute as well.
Oh, nice. Very cool. Alan, it's almost the end of the year. It's almost, I don't want to keep you too long as well, the end of the show. It's been a terrible week for crypto. Looking into 2023, and again, I'll remind people, you are not a fortune teller. I'm not a fortune teller. What positive things can you see happening next year for Boba, for Enya, for crypto in general? If there are any.
Definitely. So for projects like Boba that has resources to continue building, Enya will continue contributing to the project. And because we're in this for the long haul, this is not the first time I'm part of a team that is building infrastructure. And it always takes longer to build infrastructure than it is to build a quick flip. But the satisfaction comes from building something that lasts. Bear markets don't last forever, but if we're building infrastructure that is of substance, of value that developers and users actually use, it will definitely outlast any bear market. And so that's what gives us hope. And we see a lot of peers in the industry who share the same values. We're going to be heads down building, regardless of what's going on in the macro environment.
Nice. I think that is like the perfect way to end off today's show is just building, like you said, building something that lasts it's a different kind of satisfaction. Thank you so much for your time today. We've talked about so much. I understand hybrid compute, which was really nice, and it's fantastic, and machine learning and all the cool games that I'm going to look up literally immediately after the show because it is Tuesday morning my time. Alan, is there anything else you want to mention about Boba or Enya that you haven't had a chance to mention? Anything social media wise? I have all of Boba's socials. I have Enya's socials. Those will all be down in the podcast show notes and the YouTube channel show notes as well. Any pearls of wisdom you want to leave our audience with?
I would say, yes, definitely follow us on Twitter, Boba Network. And if you are like us who believe in the long-term benefits and potential of decentralization, of a permissionless infrastructure that for the world, then don't lose hope just because we have had a terrible year and a terrible week. This almost always happens with any new technology. We're here for the long term, we're building for the long term, and many people like us are. And going into next year, the good news is there'll be much less noise, much less shilling, a lot more substance. So it'll be easier to figure out who are actually building meaningful projects and meaningful products and infrastructure. So don't lose hope. Stay focused on quality projects like Boba and give us feedback, give us input, how we could do a better job. We're all ears. I'm available on Twitter as well. Just my first name, last name, Alan Chiu is my handle. Happy to engage with anyone on Twitter.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, and I think you're already taking that first step. I wish more founders and CEOs would just be there and be available. And I know, like, not just our show, of course, because if you guys Google Alan's name, you'll find him on multiple places, on YouTube, on podcasts, on other media places. And I think that's, like, Alan, that's a fantastic job for making time to do that. So I really appreciate it as a typical crypto person. Very cool, Alan. Thank you very much again. And hopefully we can talk to you sometime next year when things are a bit more rosy.
Looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.